Hey, what's going on everyone? Welcome back to Woody's Workshop. If you saw my previous video, then you already know what I've got going on, but if you haven't, what I have here is a BMW N57 diesel engine out of a F15 X5. What I'm doing on this engine is I'm replacing the timing chains, the guides, and the tensioners. Unfortunately, this is a fairly common issue, and BMW, in all of their wisdom, decided to put this chain drive at the back of the engine. It's pretty stupid if you ask me. In BMW's logic, there's two main reasons for why they did this. The number one reason, which I think is, it's a stretch, but the number one reason, if you were to ask BMW, is that by relocating the chain to the rear of the engine, it allowed them to lower the front of the engine, which in turn increases the space of the top of the engine, the space between the top of the engine and the hood, which is supposed to increase the safety of the vehicle if there was a pedestrian impact. So pretty much if you hit someone, there's a bigger gap for the hood to get crushed down. Do I think that's why they did it? I don't know. Sounds kind of far-fetched to me. But the second reason, which I find super entertaining, is that in BMW's own words, hang on, I've got this here. BMW's own words. Let's see. The rotational vibrations are significantly reduced due to the inertial mass of the transmission at this end. This results in an enormous relief of load on the chain drive. One of the consequences of this arrangement is that various components are installed in unconventional locations or positions. Yeah, no kidding. So not only did it obviously not decrease the load, because here we are with a less than 100,000 mile engine that has a stretched chain, but they did get one thing right in their whole design. They got one thing right. It's in an unconventional location. So this is where we're at. This is what we're doing. With all that said, let's tear right into it. First thing I want to show you is my very nice Chinese timing kit. This kit cost me about $100, and I bought it on Amazon and it was delivered next day. So there's a lot of expensive timing tools out there. I think this one is perfectly fine. Even comes with a bunch of additional stuff that you wouldn't get in a more expensive kit. So this is for our camshaft fixture. This is for our high pressure fuel pump sprocket removal. This is a very kind of cool design. I'll show you how that works later on in the video. This tool here is what we're going to be using to lock our crankshaft. It even comes with this nice little handle, so we can kind of turn it by hand if we wanted to, without having to use this guy here, which would be for turning the crank at the front of the crankshaft. Given we're going to be in the rear, I'll be using this. But just to show you where we're at, I've kind of already got this engine timed up. You can see the two dots on the exhaust cam are lined up with the one dot on the intake cam. And I'll show you how our crankshaft is aligned. Let's see here. So we're going to use this tool. It pivots off of the dowel. It's kind of hard to do with one hand. There we go. It pivots off of the dowel, and that's what gives you the leverage to be able to turn the crankshaft. You do have to be careful if you're using this. It would come in contact with both the oil pump and the chain guide, so you got to kind of move the tool, side to side. But once you've got this in place, this bolt hole right here will line up. If I can do this with one hand, may not be able to do this with one hand. Let's see. Yep, there we go. So that will lock our crankshaft in place for while we're removing all of this stuff off of here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take off the oil pump. So if you were just doing the chain and the guides, you probably wouldn't want to take off the entire oil pump. You probably just want to take off this sprocket. And if that's the case, something that's very important is this is a reverse thread. So this is a righty-loosey, lefty-tighty. So everything you've ever learned, forget it, because if you go and you try and loosen this like a conventional bolt, you're going to really wish you hadn't. So just keep that in mind if you remove this. And also, you do want to replace this bolt, and obviously it needs to be torqued to spec. This is a critical part. If for some reason that doesn't get torqued properly, it could be catastrophic and result in you destroying your entire engine. So I am, like I mentioned before, I am going to be doing rod bearings on this engine. So I'm just going to remove the entire oil pump and just, you know, clock it towards the front of the engine and dip the chain off. So I'm not even going to fuss with that. I've got to take the oil pump off anyways to do the rod bearings later on. So that's how I'm going to be removing it. But just so you know how to remove this if you needed to, that's how you do it. So at this point, I've got everything timed up. One thing I didn't show you is the cam fixture. So the cam fixture goes on the intake cam. You can see there are these flat spots right there and right there on either side of the exhaust cam. I'm sorry, not the intake cam. And it goes just like this. Super simple. Just sits flush. Make sure it sits flush on both sides of the cylinder head, which it does. And by locking the exhaust cam, since these are gear to gear, in turn you're also locking the intake cam. So it does everything all in one. So with that, I've got my crank locked, my cam locked, my timing marks lined up there. Everything's in place. I'm gonna go ahead and take off my oil pump, and we'll start tearing down the chains, getting the high pressure sprocket off, and pretty much stripping all this old stuff off. First thing we're going to do with our crankshaft still locked in place and our cam lock still in place, we're going to thread this. If you look at this high pressure fuel pump sprocket, it has internal threads along the inside here. That's where this comes into play. So this is going to thread in here like this. It's really kind of cool actually. This is a 13 millimeter. Just want to snug it up. Nothing too crazy, just snug it up. And then you are going to release the bolt, or the center bolt of the sprocket, and that is at E14 Torx. And what's going to happen here is when you release this bolt, like that, you're going to be able to back it off by hand to a point. Once it gets tight, what's happening is the head of this center bolt is pushing against this collar that you just installed. It's pretty much just a really compact reverse puller design. So as you back this off, it'll get tight eventually. And it will pull the sprocket. Obviously I still have all my guides and everything in place, so I'm not going to try and go too crazy here, but just enough to get my sprocket off. There we go. That should be enough. You'll hear it pop, and that should be loose at this point. So I'm going to take off my tensioners and my guides now so I can slack up this center chain. I'll be replacing this tensioner, so I can kind of just let it come apart. Not a big deal. It's going to leak a little bit. Obviously you got to reuse this hardware for this tensioner, so now that that's off, just toss it or set it to the side. So I have my bottom tensioner off. I've got my crank still locked in place, cam still locked in place. I'm going to go ahead and take these guides off. These are a T45. now that I have my lower guides off, and this is my high pressure fuel pump sprocket is loose, I'm not going to be putting any rotational force on the crankshaft anymore. So at this point, I'm okay to, obviously you've got to remove this fixture in order to get the chains off the end of the crankshaft. So at this point, I'm going to remove this hold down fixture. You just let it swing to the side, really. I'm going to start working on taking off the chain from the from the camshaft down to the high pressure fuel pump now. First thing I'm going to do is remove these guides. Probably should have taken the tensioner out before I did that, but I forgot, so I'm going to go ahead and take this tensioner out. This is a 24 millimeter, and it's a little snug. And there goes the tensioner. Or actually, I'm sorry, there's the guide. So probably should have taken that tensioner out first. Honestly, I kind of forgot it was there, but you get the idea. So the top guide here has these two plugs that are double as the dowels. There we go. See, kind of cool. It's a plug and it's a dowel at the same time. Now that I have the guides out of the way, I can go ahead and take off these three E10s that hold on the camshaft sprocket. This sprocket, it doesn't matter where it aligns. It does, as you can see, it's slotted, so it can rotate left, right, left, right. You pretty much just need to make sure it's not bottomed out when you put the tensioner in and you're retorquing this stuff and putting it back together. But don't worry about the orientation of this. You can just go ahead and remove it. So we're ready to take this chain off. There we go, straight out of the top. Now we can take our oil pump chain off. Set it to the side. We take our high pressure fuel pump sprocket off. Take it off this side first. I still have the tool in place. I'll have to remove that here once I get it off. You just take that right off of there. At this point, I've got all my chains out of here. Everything's off. This is pretty much completely stripped down with the exception of this little oil sprayer right here. I'm not replacing that. I don't see the need to do that. At this point, I'm going to start to clean up all this sealant along the mating surface of the rear timing cover. And once that's all cleaned up and spotless, I'll start to reinstall the chains. So before I go installing the chains, you see I've got all my old tensioners, guides, everything over there. All my new stuff is over here. But you can actually see very, very minor. This is on the larger chain. So this is from the high pressure fuel pump down to the crankshaft. It is stretched, but very minor. This chain from the camshaft down to the high pressure fuel pump, you can see is pretty significantly stretched. They're lined up there at the top. That's how much stretch we've got in them. One way to identify the new chains versus the old, do my best to zoom in here, but you can actually see the rivets on these chains have little diamonds on them. This is how you identify a revised new BMW chain. So now that I've shown you that, I'm going to go ahead and continue on installing the chains. Okay, so now that I've got everything cleaned up, I'm ready to start installing all my new timing chain and guides and everything. So first I'm going to take my new high pressure fuel pump sprocket. You can see it's indexed. I don't know if you can see that on the camera. Yeah, it's indexed. It lines up with the drive for the high pressure fuel pump. So I'm going to take my large chain, my thicker fat chain. I'm going to go ahead and put this on here. And BMW was nice enough to put a little index right here so you can see where the notch is without, you know, when it's not visible. So we're going to drape this around the crank. Get it lined up as best we can. All right, There we go. Now I'm going to take my E14 bolt. I put some blue thread locker on it. I'm not going to torque this just quite yet, but when you do torque it, this is 65 Newton meters. I'm just going to snug it up for now until I get everything in place. Now I'm going to take my camshaft sprocket. Like I said earlier, this is slotted. It doesn't matter where it falls on the actual cam gear. Just as long as it's not bottomed out in this slot, you're fine. Scoop that up. All right, now I'm going to take my 3 E10 bolts, blue thread locker again on those. These are going to end up getting torqued to, I believe, 17 Newton meters. So I'm just going to get these started for now. Okay, now that I have everything loosely fitted, and I have my cam block still in place, it's still flat on the cylinder head, I'm going to install my crankshaft holder back into place. Now I'm going to place my new lower guides where they belong. Once again, blue thread locker on these. These are going to be torqued to 20 Newton meter. All these guide pins are going to be torqued to 20 Newton meter. This top one is just a slide. Here's the top guide. I'm going to go ahead and torque these guide pins to 20 Newton meter. For the top chain, I'm going to install this lower guide pin first. That way I can drop this guide down. You see it's slotted here. It'll sit on that while I line up the top guide pin. On these bolts, you definitely want to put a decent amount of thread sealant here, just so it seals the back of this cylinder head. These are also going to get torqued to 20 Newton meter. Now with that pin in place, you can take your top guide, slide it down the chain, and it'll sit right on top. So you can then install your second pin. Now we can install our lower guide for the upper chain. Now that I've got my guides in place, I'm going to install my tensioners. So the tensioner for the top chain is a 24 millimeter, and you're going to need to torque this to 70 Newton meters. Here's our lower chain tensioner, and you can see it has this really long oil channel with a small feed hole here. That feed hole lines up with this hole here on the engine block. You really need to make sure this mating surface is really clean. Any debris in here in this channel could result in failure of this tensioner and ultimately premature failure of the timing chain, or excessive noise right when you start up the truck. So you really need to make sure that that surface there is really spotless before you install this. These bolts will need to be torqued to 10 Newton meter. Once in place, you can preload the tensioner by hand, compressing the tensioner just enough so you can remove this installation pin. I'll show you what that looks like here. You just compress it and then it releases the tension on the tensioner. And you can save this for later, keep it in your toolbox. These are always good to have if you're doing timing chains on BMW engines, or if you're really just tearing them down, disassembling, this is nice to be able to retain tensioners in place. Now that I've got my tensioners in, everything's nice and tight, I can go ahead and do my final torque on the high pressure fuel pump drive. That's going to be 65 Newton meters. All right. All that's left is my final torque on my camshaft sprocket. And like I said earlier, those are going to be 17 Newton meters. When you do this, you want to, before you go torquing these down, you want to make sure, like I was saying earlier, you want to make sure they're not bottomed out in the travel slot. If that was the case, you need to rotate the chain to accommodate and recenter those bolts. That's not the case for me. Mine's nice and centered. So I can go ahead and do my final torque. All right, so that's pretty much it. You can see I've got the new chains, guides, tensioners, and sprocket installed. Everything's lined up nicely. At this point, if you were putting everything back together, you'd want to go ahead and put the oil pump back on, turn the engine over at least 2 to 4 revolutions, and double check your timing. So you'd want to come back in here, make sure your timing marks line up on the back side of these cams, make sure your fixture sits flush on the cylinder head, and make sure your crankshaft holder aligns properly from the pin to this hole. So at this point, I'm not going to go any further. I'm not going to throw the oil pump on because, like I said, I am doing rod bearings on this as well. I haven't decided if I'm going to make a video on that or not, but this is as far as I'm going to take it. Once you confirm the timing marks, it's pretty much just complete reassembly. You know, reinstalling the rear timing cover, valve cover, oil pan, and then just putting all this junk back on. So this is as far as I'm going to take this video. As always, if you found this helpful, please consider you know, liking the video or possibly subscribing to the channel. If you have any questions about this process, you know, the tools I use, the steps I took, anything really at all, feel free to leave a comment below and I'll do my best to get back with you. But as always, you know, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.